Howdy, of you delicious people. I am here today to review the 7th episode of American Gods Season Trace. So, we're in this place to ultimately go and review all of what had gone on in this episode. So, reasonably and or rationally in this episode, really, there's just that consistent notion of just me going like, okay, I guess some things happened in this episode, but there wasn't really enough to really just say I needed to sit down and see what happens in here. Like, reasonably, a lot of it is just like, okay, this guy fought this guy, and that's about it. Reasonably, a lot of it is just like, okay, everybody is starting to arrange things, but that's about it. Really, there's a lot of kind of dead time or dead air in this episode, even though there are quasi ballparkingly interesting things, meaning that there is some interesting things that they do with visuals in this episode, but really for the most part it's just like random stuff happened and people have to deal with it, and then along we go. Like, it's not something that I would tell people, man, you need to go out of your way to watch episode 7. But because there's only one big thing that happens in here, but we could have already said that that was going to happen in the last episode. Really, we had it to where Mr. World in the last episode was orchestrating to tie himself onto Laura and Salim. We were on the last episode seeing some thief that was going around stealing people's lingerie. That ultimately gets some quasi conclusion in here. We ultimately have it at some point where probably I had gotten confused where other people were at some points in time, and I apologize about that. So yeah. So let's get into here, and let's ultimately just say that there, to me, is like a lot of bizarrish visuals going on within this episode. There's points in time where I'm like, okay, is this a dream or is it reality or what's going on? Do we just have to assess that this is a dream because this makes no sense? Do we have to assess that reasonably all of this doesn't make any rational sense for the most part? Could we just have at some point Shadow Moon being waking up at some point and have this all be over? Will that be the ending of the show? Again, there is barely anything that really resembles a war going on in this show anymore. Basically, the whole thing that ultimately has Bilquist in this episode, I'm like, what was the point of this? What was the point of this? I don't know. Like, she was just talking to some old lady in this episode to otherwise say that she had some importance, but I didn't understand why. I'm so baffled and confused by some of this stuff of why these people are important and why they do the things that they do in this show. Uh, when really looking at it, some of the stuff is just like, I'm only really liking what is really going on with Shadow Moon. Every time I see Shadow Moon, I'm like, oh, okay, something interesting is going to be afoot, and that's about it. Everybody else is just kind of like, man, this is just like dragging on. But I think let's go and drag on to ultimately talk about what happens within this episode. Let's go into spoilers because at the end of the day, people will want to exactly know and exactly say that, like, okay, what is really going on with this because I skipped the episode. Because a lot of people have probably just given up at some point, and reasonably and or rationally I can understand that. It's just there's some episodes that are really good, which are all the early ones, all the first season ones, but then everything after this is just a mind f where it's just like, come on, like, get to the point already. Get to the war part, which everyone has been waiting for 2 seasons for. I I bet the very last episode is probably going to be a giant flashback episode where we're just going to go in and just be like, okay, this is probably going to tie into one person and it's going to be a flashback, and that's the way that season 3 is going to end. And I'm like, if it seriously goes that route, if it seriously goes that way, then I'm gonna be like, God, like, so they are just stretching this out like a mother. Because I'm assuming that it's going to be some flashbacky thing. Because I feel like there's going to be some story that is going to otherwise not conclude any number of things, and people are just going to be upset because it didn't get to the war. It didn't. We haven't gone anywhere with any of these stories. A lot of things have been stretched so thin uh, to otherwise tick everyone off. So I'm not going to tick anybody off anymore. Let's go into that spoiler time. At the end of the day, just just a rough episode still to this day. Spoiler time, spoiler time. Let's go out of our way to say that we saw this episode and spoil it. So, we ultimately have it to where within this episode we have Odin's fiance coming to the realization that she's starting to realize that Odin is actually legitimately a god. It seems like that didn't ring in her head any time earlier, I guess. So, going on in here, we ultimately have it to where seemingly Odin and his fiance are just driving along a road, and she's trying to get him to talk because she doesn't know where she's going. She's just kind of going in the middle of nowhere and just continue to drive. All of a sudden, it just seems like there is a human sack of body that otherwise just falls out of the sky, and Odin's fiance stops at her tracks. Odin gets out of the car. She gets out of the car. And then Odin gets her back into the car, and Odin gets back into the driver's seat and then drives off. That really answers a lot. So, we end up having it to where ultimately. So, uh, Odin's fiance is ending up talking to Shadow Moon at some point and ultimately saying, like, oh my god, is this really happening? Like, is it really is this really real? Like, ultimately, I just see charcoal bodies or torn apart bodies just falling out of the sky, and I don't understand what any of this means. Well, we ultimately seemingly have it to where Wednesday is going and talking with Shadow Moon, and it seems that ultimately Odin is wanting to have Shadow Moon work with him again, and Shadow Moon is like, you know what, I'm fine here. Like, I'm fine at the lakeside or Lakeview or whatever the heck that this place is called. Because ultimately, we end up finding out that Shadow Moon is ultimately going to be dipping his schwanz into ultimately a woman in a jacuzzi later on in this episode, which is his property manager, because it seems like him and his property manager properly go into seemingly a ice skate date of sorts, and then eventually they end up going into jacuzzi, which ultimately we have Shadow Moon making it snow for the lady. Making it snow, and then, popping the uncle, if you know what I mean. Getting into the jacuzzi, whatever, bedroom business? I don't know. I don't know what to call it. There's no jacuzzi equivalent to bedroom business. Anyways, but before that, so Shadow Moon is ultimately saying, hey, I'm fine. I'm fine here. We ultimately end up having it to where Odin's fiance was freaking out, but ultimately we have it to where Odin is like, well, hey, since the chips are all on the table now and you know exactly what's going on, like, do you want to call it quits now? Because this girl just just answered some ad for some guy and didn't realize it was going to be a god. So she ends up going, you know what? Sure, what the heck? Why not? Life is short. So we end up having them going off. So we ultimately have to come to the consensus of, hey, where is Bilquist in all this? Because ultimately we have to care about Bilquist, because ultimately instead of her doing anything that has anything to do with fertility or whatever, the thing that she was a god of, instead she is just going everywhere now and just bizarrely dancing, I guess, with Ocean and all the other dancing gods, I guess. We ultimately have it to where Bilquist ends up going into seemingly this like I guess I would have to call it like a community center of sorts, where like everybody's all like dancing and stuff like that and getting together and just beating on some bizarrish looking buckets and stuff like that to ultimately get a rhythm and whatever for everybody, just like, yeah, I'm gonna be dancing around. So we ultimately have it to where Bilquist is getting her groove on, and ultimately it seems that there is an old lady that is seemingly near to death. Ultimately, it seems like there is an old lady that is coming to everybody and saying like, hey, I'm not dead yet. That is consistently what she is saying. And then ultimately we have it to where Bilquist ends up dancing along with these other gods of sorts, just dancing around. And then we have it to where this old lady joins this girl in this dance. And ultimately we end up finding out that this old lady is actually a midwife for Shadow Moon. So there's some kind of there is some kind of backstory of Shadow Moon told me say how Shadow Moon was ushered into the world, I guess. We ultimately have it also, as we are to go along here, we have Laura ultimately signing a deal with Salim to go and kill Mr. Wednesday. We ultimately have Mr. Wednesday in this of course office where where all the tech people, all his like Steven Job looking motherfuckers are just sitting around, ultimately just orchestrating a deal. We ultimately have it to where Laura is like, you know what, I think I can make a deal for myself, and Salim ends up pulling her aside and he's like, you know what, I think I can make a better deal for you. So we end up going in there, and so Laura asks for the Spear of Odin to get that back. And so ultimately, Mr. World is like, okay, I'll give you that. I'll give you, because he's still the same guy from the last episode, which ultimately is the different Mr. World than normal Mr. World, whatever. It's not the same actor. So because heaven forbid you act, but at least it's continuity, I guess. So we end up having it to where Mr. World is going and offering them that they are going to get the Spear of Odin, and ultimately they are offering them basically the world, pun intended. So we end up having it to where Laura is saying, okay, I want a deal. I want to have Salim, Shadow Moon, and me all protected. And ultimately, we have it to where they're like sealing a deal with Mr. World, and basically they're going to tell them exactly when they are going to get the Spear of Odin and stuff along those lines. Ba 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 ba. So that deal has been struck, that they are going to work together. And I'm just like, wow, we just needed to take the time to orchestrate a deal to get their alliance going together. Like, it couldn't have just been that Mr. World could have just handed them all these things on a platter. Like, hey, here's the spear. There you go. I'm going to take you exactly where Odin is, stab him in the heart, and because ultimately we have it to where Mr. World says that if Mr. World were to attack Odin, then a war would be started. But if Laura ends up going and attacking and killing Odin, then a war does not get started. So that is why Mr. World chose Laura to put this war together, because Laura is no one. Until they probably find out the paper trail. So, so ultimately, so what else is going on in this episode? Let's get to Shadow Moon. So, but also, wait a minute. Let's get to some kind of muckety muck before we get to the Shadow Moon parts. So, ultimately, Mr. Wednesday goes off and speaks to a guy named Dunker to ultimately find Johan. Because ultimately, we have it to where Johan was the death metal guy in the bar that was otherwise looking like a Rob Zombie looking motherfucker. And so ultimately, we end up finding out that Mr. Wednesday goes to this Dunker guy and he solves this riddle of booze. And so we end up having it to where me, Mr. Wednesdays to look for, I believe, Johan to eventually realize that Dunker tells Wednesday that Johan went off to go and speak to a dentist, which is Tyrell. So Tyrell ultimately is to talk to Johan, and Johan has transformed into his monstrous looking self. So it's an interesting visual that lasts about maybe less than 5 seconds. And so we end up having Tyrell consistently screaming to Johan, it's like, dude, go home, go back, goodbye, like, go away. Like, if anything you're gonna regret, like, coming at me, bro. So, like, I'll save the Moon Knight stuff, or Moon Knight. I'll save the Shadow Moon stuff for very last, and then because we'll carve all that out. Because the Shadow Moon stuff is basically like the last thing you see in this episode, so we'll get to that. So, because Shadow Moon also, it's not the entire, like everything that I mentioned earlier with Shadow Moon, like that's not all. There's some things as well. So, Mr. Wednesday eventually goes to see Tyrell, and we end up having it to where Johan is dead, and Tyrell had left a note mentioning that, hey, I'm gonna get your son and meet me at this place. Ultimately, we have it to where, okay, let's get to the Shadow Moon stuff. So ultimately, we have it to where Shadow Moon had saw the thief who had stolen all the lingerie. We end up finding out that Shadow Moon eventually reports it to the sheriff, and then the sheriff, of course, we kind of back way around this. We end up having it to where, like, Shadow Moon ends up going to the people of the town and ultimately mention, hey, yeah, I saw a thief last night. And so ultimately they go, oh, well, just go to the sheriff with this, because they could have done that. He could have done that right away. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up going to the sheriff. Sheriff ends up getting the kid, and so we end up having it bizarrely that this kid could otherwise be tied to this missing girl that is still missing, and I think her name is Allison, I think. So we have it to where this thief is ultimately to be said that he has done theft through seemingly 11 different houses, and so ultimately this kid is going to be caught and put to jail. Whoop-de-doo. Who cares? Who cares about that part of that story? Why did they have to take so much time to just be like, they could have done all this in like 2 seconds, of like, could have called the sheriff and said, hey, thief, that guy, go get him, and then go get him, and could have been done. 2 seconds, but they had to stretch this mother out. Good God. So now we're to the parts mostly that I had mentioned. we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon ends up going and uh, skating with his property manager. But bizarrely, we ultimately have it to where there seems to be some kind of bizarrish elephant of sorts that ends up going into the icy waters. And bizarrely, we end up having it to where Shadow Moon eventually realizes that there is something seemingly in the water. And we eventually have it to where Shadow Moon falls on his butt because he's horrible at skating. And so we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up seeing an elephant god of sorts into the water. That ultimately we have it to where this elephant god ends up going and uh, taking this coin and kind of putting a hole through to give Shadow Moon this coin. This coin ends up going behind this car and bizarrely vanishes, and we don't quite understand why. We are to assess or to assume maybe that Shadow Moon is dreaming this. Like he hasn't even been with this girl, or I don't know. It's all kinds of weird, this portion of part, because ultimately we could assess that Shadow Moon was like dreaming this whole entire long stretch of time, because all of this is very confusing at some points. So pushing on. So we have it to where ultimately, like I had said, Shadow Moon and his property manager end up going and having a jacuzzi together, and we have it to where his property manager mentions that it's like, well, yeah, it's nice to be in this jacuzzi and all, but I would I love the fact that we ultimately have it to where I would love it to have it to where we could have snowfall on us because I think that would be so much better. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up making it snow, like he makes it rain all the time. Makes it rain with that money. Makes it rain. So we end up having it to where ultimately that Shadow Moon calls it a bar trick, and so ultimately we end up having it to where property manager and Shadow Moon end up getting busy in this jacuzzi, but you can't really see much. You can kind of see things here and there, but of course, bizarrely, this show has to censor things more than it would have before for some odd reason. If anything, you probably see Shadow Moon's Batukus, but that's probably about it. If you're really into Shadow Moon's Batukus, then by all means. So we seemingly have it that Shadow Moon and property manager are getting busy in this jacuzzi, and then bizarrely they are ending up laying in the snow. They are laying in the snow together, and I'm like, isn't that cold? And you are effing crazy to be laying in the snow. But then bizarrely we have it to where ultimately, so we have it to where Shadow Moon and property manager are laying with no clothes on in the snow, and then right next to them is bizarrely also Shadow Moon just walking and trudging through the snow, ultimately just going, "Hello, it's me. I'm Adele. Hello. Is anybody out there?" We ultimately have it to where bizarrely there is some man and a horse that ultimately comes to Shadow Moon, and I don't understand what any of this means. And then all of a sudden, we bizarrely have seemingly all of these things around Shadow Moon, like seemingly these snow hands are like grasping for Shadow Moon. Like basically hands made out of snow that are starting to grasp for Shadow Moon bizarrely closer and closer, and we don't know what any of that means. Because ultimately, right after that, Shadow Moon wakes up in a bed next to his property manager, and what the heck was any of that? So, we end up having Shadow Moon and property manager waking up to Tyrell ultimately mentioning, "Hey, you, me, everybody, let's all go. We gotta go on a road trip." And ultimately, that is basically how this episode ends, with basically Tyrell leaving a note, the dentist leaving a note. It's like, "Hey, we gotta go." Like Odin is eventually going to come on down to meet Tyrell at some point. So, really, for the most part, that is everything that happens in this episode. Again, you could probably deem it as important or not important. Either way, it's an episode. So I think that's all that I really wanted to say about this review. Reasonably, I think, if anything, there are a lot of times where I get things baffled and or confused because that's exactly what this show does. Like, it never explains anything. Like, God, I wish that there would have been just like name tags on the bottom of certain things, but like, oh, this is so and so person. He's God of so and so, or like, God, if there's one show that I think needs like help describing things or help understanding things, it's this show. But I also like the bizarre dream sequences, or like the entire time you could probably think that, is Shadow Moon crazy? Is this all really happening? Any number of things. Like, it's kind of like the if you want to go the Moon Knight route, um, for Marvel. Like, is this guy crazy this entire time, or all these things really and truly happening? Like, you could have it to where the guy just snapped in prison, and that could be resolving of this whole entire show. Would be the very last episode, you'd find out that Shadow Moon was just in prison, just losing his effing mind for being in prison for too long, and so on and so forth. Like, you never know. Like, it could have really been Shadow Moon just losing his effing mind, and ultimately that could be a real true consensus of this show as well. So, other than that, I'm going to get out of here. I don't want to stretch this any more than I should. If anything, yeah, like, these episodes aren't as fun as they used to be. They kind of have gotten to like a little bit of uh, like, I guess, like, the good thing about these episodes is they're not as complicated to review. So I guess that's a good thing, but also I guess that could be a bad thing, because it's like, well, this show is so slow that there's nothing going on in it. So it's easy to just breeze through this whole review and get it all done. But with this one, yeah, it's not as complicated as it was, where ultimately you'd have to just go and like, yeah, now I need to really know who 8 different people are and figure who they all are out, and so on and so forth. No, like, they kind of minimize the cast to otherwise not add people in or whatever, um, which I think is great, because when looking at it, I think they have to minimize the cast anyways because of the new normal. But yeah, so I'm got nothing else to say. I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.